I'm Jammer. So, a while back I did a video about this book here, Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on Serious Earth by Grant Morrison and Dave McKean. This is, like, without a doubt, one of my all-time favorite graphic novels. It was one of the earliest just independent graphic novels that I had read, and it was one of the books that I read right as I was getting back into comics as a medium in my early 20s as I was going back to college. Now, I did that video largely the way I do all of my videos for this channel. I hold up a book, I try to be funny, make some cute mannerisms and stuff, and then I just talk for about half an hour, and usually most people clock out after the first 5 minutes when they realize there's not going to be butts in that episode. It did its job, and I am happy with the way it came out. But here's the thing. I can talk for days about this book and just about all the elements in it and why I think it's really important to talk about. And so I thought, why don't I just do that? Because after a while, I'm sure people are tired of the half-hour segments, and it might be easier to just try to tackle little bits of this book at a time to just explore elements of it and hopefully show you more and more and more why I think this book is worth your time and really interesting. Now, one thing that I wanted to sort of clue into is the way that rereading Arkham Asylum is really the key at getting at the heart of what this book actually is. Because when you reread something, it sounds cliche, but it's true. You notice things that you didn't notice the first time. It's because the first time you were seeing something, it's like watching a movie for the first time you're reading a book. You are focusing on the main aspects of the story. When you've read it a second time, you know what the story is, so your eye or your mind's eye is allowed to veer off a little bit while following the main story, and while you're veering off, you notice small details. Part of that is simply because we're dealing with the artwork of Dave McKean, and if you've never read anything by Dave McKean, visually speaking, the man is something of a marvel. I mean, he is unlike any artist that I've really experienced in my lifetime, largely because he truly explores multimedia and the idea of he uses photography, he uses sculpture, he uses pen and ink, he uses oil paint, acrylic paint. Any type of visual medium, Dave McKean has experimented with in some form or capacity. That's one of the things that makes Arkham Asylum so interesting. If looking at just one single page of the book is kind of enough to really communicate that moment to you, because if we look at this moment here, the moment after Amadeus Arkham has discovered his mother has sitting in bed eating beetles, we see the panel layout, which is really interesting. We observe here a combination of actual drawing, pen and ink styles, but then also we see photography. And then in the background, we observe these structures here. These appear to be kind of architectural layouts. And then this image right here, and then this image right here. It takes a second to really observe what these structures are, but what in fact they are gears. And what exactly do you typically, or where exactly do you typically find gears? You find gears again and again and again, particularly in relation to this book, in clocks. Now, why is clock, or why do gears summon clocks in relation to Amadeus Arkham? Well, if you watch the video, or if you took the time to read this book, you probably remember about midway through the story, Amadeus Arkham returns to his home trying to find Harriet and his daughter Constance. We see, or no, excuse me, his wife is Constance, his daughter's name is Harriet. He enters into the room and he discovers his wife Constance has been murdered and, as he describes it, just horrifically violated. Mad Dog Hawkins supposedly mutilates the genitals of his victims after he has finished torturing them and or raping them. It's heavy shit. Now, after this, though, he looks around for his daughter Harriet, and as he looks into the dollhouse, he discovers, sure enough, she's been beheaded and her body has been placed in the dollhouse. But what's important is this revelation or this discovery of his daughter is set against the ringing of the cuckoo clock. Now again, why is that so important and significant in and of itself? And can we really make the case that the gears are kind of foreshadowing to the discovery that his wife and daughter has been murdered? Well, I think it can, because Again, the story of Arkham Asylum is a back and forth between the story of Amadeus Arkham and then the story of Batman as he's making his way through the asylum, encountering all the villains of Arkham. We're focusing right now on Amadeus Arkham, not Batman. What's important here is that every single time up to the discovery of Harriet and Constance, anytime we see Amadeus Arkham, there is the image at some point or another of gears or a clock. We see in this point here, as he's making his return to the asylum, eventually mirroring Batman, who makes his entrance into the asylum, this large page panel here, where there's a huge clock or huge gear work in the background. And at this moment, we hear him, "For the first time in 12 years, I spend the night in my old room. I do not sleep well. My dreams are haunted by beating wings. And outside, far off, a dog barks on and off through the whole restless night." So, contextually, we see here, while at first his return to the asylum is green and bushy and bright, we then return to the moon, we return to discomfort, and we return to gears, just like the first appearance when he discovered his mother was eating beetles. A later passage, again, when he's working in Metropolis, and then he goes to sleep and he dreams. He narrates to the reader a long dream about being in the tunnel of love and having a horrific experience. Again, we see the combination of these bright green panels, the happy scene with his child, and then the shift again to the moon, blue, and then eventually again, gears. Again, we have an instance in which we have this sense of foreboding in Amadeus Arkham, that something is troubling him terribly underneath the surface. Finally, the last scene before the discovery of Harriet and Constance's murder, we have a scene in which Amadeus Arkham returns from Europe, and we see him on a page that is, for the most part, bright and happy. We even have this almost sort of jarring image of the family all together, sort of feeling happy. And again, we note right here the presence of a clock. It's a little thing. It's a tiny thing, but it's important because, again, Dave McKean and Grant Morrison have sort of continually been employing the imagery of gears and clocks as a way of foreboding Amadeus Arkham's eventual mental collapse. Because it's not long after this sequence that he eventually discovers his family, and then by the end of the story, he has gone full tilt insane, going to the point of, it's a little difficult to see on this page, but if you can just make it out, carving a inscription spell into the cell of his unit with his fingernails. Again, I think there's something to be said about observing the repetition of this visual imagery, because Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on This Serious Earth is a book which is loaded with symbol, both in terms of the visual language, in terms of the visual construction, and then also as well in terms of the actual narrative itself. Grant Morrison in interviews has said, honestly, that this book is, for the most part, an exploration of symbolism as it relates to Batman. This is effectively Batman undergoing a kind of symbolic spiritual journey. So I don't believe it's unfair to suggest that Dave McKean is using a lot of visual, symbolic imagery, oftentimes to sort of remind us or foreshadow elements in the plot that are going to come into play later on narratively in the story. And especially when we discuss the sort of final discovery of Harriet and Constance, it's important here to go to, say, the 15th anniversary, or you may have the 25th anniversary. In the back of these new editions, you have the actual original script that Morrison wrote of Arkham Asylum, A Serious House on a Serious Earth. And in the sequence, or the original script for the book, he notes that he actually ingests pieces, or it's at least suggested that he ingests parts of the bodies of his wife and daughter after their discovery. And Morrison notes, this was originally a shamanic cannibal sequence of which only vague hints, suggestions, and shadowy threats remain. And then as Amadeus Arkham is talking about throwing up later while wearing his mother's old wedding dress, the cannibal scene was intended to show Arkham reverting to a hardwired primordial behavior patterns as his psyche disintegrates. Every tribal society often consumed parts of their dead as a way of retaining something of the spiritual essence of the departed. So, again, there's a lot of sort of grotesque imagery at first with this sequence, but I think also what's really important and probably something that can get very easily missed is later on when, right after the Tunnel of Love sequence, we observe Batman entering into the asylum. It's kind of difficult to see in this edition, but there's one shot where we see Batman observing something on his fingertips. By the looks of it, it's a little difficult to make out, but it looks like something chalky and white, and then the Joker says it's salt. And then, of course, he follows it up with, why don't you sprinkle some on me, honey? Aren't I just good enough to eat? Because he's the Joker. He's got to taunt Batman. But salt is important because salt was traditionally a way of kind of keeping evil out or else keeping evil in. And so as we observe Batman, who, for some people, at least particularly in relation to this book, is the notion of evil, we observe an important sequence here of the circle of salt being a way of containing evil, and that ties back again originally to Amadeus Arkham. Again, he's continually haunted by the moon, and he's continually haunted by the clock face. Now today, digital clocks are primarily just Arabic numerals, so clock faces really aren't going to mean that much to a lot of contemporary readers. But we have to recognize again, a clock face is, traditionally speaking, a circle. And when we talk about the notion of the symbol, we have the notion here, at least in relation to this book, that time is sort of constantly taking away for Amadeus Arkham, and that ultimately he's going to be undone and revert back to his destiny, which is insanity. But I think another aspect that's really important here is the story of Amadeus Arkham is an attempt to outrun, or at least capture, insanity and contain it, and effectively in some manners destroy it, because he perceives it as a kind of vice or destructive force. It's not necessarily a bad interpretation based upon everything that happens into his life. Like, I can understand why he believes that. But nevertheless, the repetitious pattern of the gearworks and the clock always leading up to the sort of crack in his sanity, I think is really important in understanding this book. The story of Amadeus Arkham is ultimately a story of failure. Amadeus Arkham tries to challenge insanity. He tries to beat insanity. And ultimately, he just can't, because there's no real way to beat that, at least in relation to the book. In real life, insanity is mental illness, and more effort is done every single day to understand insanity and mental illness as it actually exists. And maybe one day we will finally manage to overcome mental illness by more than just prescription medication. In relation to this story, however, insanity is a kind of otherworldly supernatural force. And so the image of the circle, the image of the clockwork, the image of the gears is a kind of constant reminder to the reader that Amadeus Arkham is ultimately going to be undone by his efforts. He's never going to beat insanity. And ultimately, these foreshadowing efforts are leading us towards the conclusion that he is going to be a failure in some form or capacity. Because no matter how much he tries to overcome this, if I can add a cliche but a mathematical truth, a circle has no true beginning or end. It just begins and ends in the exact same point. It is continually looping around. And Amadeus Arkham's story is effectively a circle, and the fact that he attempts to get away from what he originally started from, and that ultimately winds up back where he began, which is mental illness. All right. I'm going to call it a day there. I hope you enjoyed this video. It's not as long as the other ones, thank goodness, right? But I'm going to try to do, hopefully, a couple more like that. Maybe this was a one-time thing, but there's so much to explore and talk about in this book, and then other books as well. So keep your eyes on the channel. Hopefully there will be more of these to come, and as soon as there are, I'll make sure to post them here. Like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. And of course, hey, thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Go read some comics.